All right, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to this morning's panel on renewable energy, changing the economic game. My name is Emily Prince. I am a second-year law student here at Tulane and this year's chair of the Environmental Law Summit. Before we wanted to get started, I just wanted to remind everyone, if you are attending this session for Professor Haupt's class, please do not forget to sign in up here. And unfortunately, this panel is not CLE eligible, so if you need CLE credit, unfortunately, this one will not count. I would like to start off by introducing our panelists this morning. First, please join me in welcoming back to Tulane Law Professor Amy Stein. Amy is a professor at the University of Florida Law School, where previously she taught here at Tulane Law and was my advisor. She attended the University of Chicago for her bachelor's degree and her Juris Doctorate. Her research and expertise is in clean energy, climate change, and environmental law. Next, I'd like to introduce Mr. Thad Cully. If you attended yesterday's panel on solar power and net metering, you may already be familiar with Thad. He's currently an associate with Keyes, Foxman, and Weidman. His practice focuses on regulatory issues related to increasing penetration of distribution generation resources on the grid. Thad is also a graduate of Tulane University Law School, and while here in a previous life, he helped run the Environmental Law Summit. So I definitely have some big shoes to fill. Finally, I'd like to introduce Mr. Simon Mahan. Simon is a renewable energy manager with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Simon's work focuses on offshore wind development here in the southeastern United States, and he works with stakeholders to promote wind energy throughout our region. He graduated from Missouri State University. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
All right. Well, good morning. It's good to see people here this early on a Saturday. And actually, how many students are there? All right. So this is the mandatory thing, Professor Haupt? All right. Well done. Well done. We appreciate that. And who attended the panel yesterday that I moderated on future solar? All right. So my recap of that panel is going to be exhilarating. What I'll do is I'll move very quickly through that. I think a part of this theme of changing the economic game, the part I'm really going to touch upon is what I would call the customer-driven market. So rather than like a top-down state mandate or a utility-sponsored program, are the market conditions right where customers, just based on their own decisions about how they want to manage their power use, are they going to help drive this forward? So I think with that in mind, Simon's going to come up and also give us a broader view of what a diverse resource mix can do on a national scale, and particularly how wind plays into that. And Professor Stein is going to take us into the future with lots of exciting developments in storage and how we're going to integrate renewables. So I'm looking forward to hearing both of those presentations. And disclaimer, since I am recapping yesterday, I wrote this PowerPoint, if you want to call it that, this morning. So prepare not to be wowed by that part of it. And technology. Did I just turn everything off? That was brilliant. Oh, look. All right, so yesterday we had Andrew Owens from Entergy Corporation, Forrest Bradley Wright, who was a public service commissioner, or a candidate for the Public Service Commission, came very close to winning that, and then Tucker Crawford, who's partner of South Coast Solar. And generally, to give you, the folks that did not have the pleasure of attending yesterday, the recap, we talked about what is called net metering policy. And net metering allows a customer to put solar on the rooftop. They can consume whatever they are able to on site, and whatever they're not able to consume on site would go back to the grid. And in exchange for doing that, they receive a credit on their bill, which is determined. So basically, the mechanism is, let's look at a month. How much did you export to the grid, and how much did you still bring in from the grid? And if those things net out, and you imported more than you exported, then you pay the utility. Otherwise, you get a credit that rolls forward. Excuse me for that. It's not that I'm sleepy or bored. So there's, determining what's driving renewables and what's going to get us to the point where we have enough renewables to make an impact on the environment, which is, I think, a question someone brought up yesterday. Is we talked a lot about economics, but no one said, well, what's the environmental benefit here? I think there's several levels. Federal level, it's been the policy of the United States for 30 plus years to encourage the use of alternate generation. It's cleaner. The Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act of 1978 provides certain rights for customers to install generation and to use it on site, and guarantees, at least to some extent, up to 20 megawatts, guarantees that the utility must purchase from those QFs. Now, above 20 megawatts, it's a lot easier for them to get rid of that requirement. They can go to the FERC. We've had talk of a federal renewable portfolio standard in Congress many times, and that just, as you know, doesn't really get far. So we'll see if that ever does become a thing. But for the most part, the federal policy is, the tax policy has been really what helps drive the markets. At the state level, that's really where I think the action is and has been, where you have renewable portfolio standards in a good number of states. As I said, see West Virginia, they just repealed theirs, which isn't terribly as tragic as it sounds when you could burn tires to count as a renewable fuel. So, that aside, recently in South Carolina, there was a bill passed that sets up a market for systems that are 10 megawatts and below, including a carve-out for systems that are 1 megawatt and below, a portion of which are supposed to come from the residential sector. So there's ongoing development there when I think they had a total of 300 net metering systems before this act. We expect to see several thousand come on in the next few years. And then, lastly, at the state level, public service commissions have tremendous power, particularly in Louisiana, where this body has a lot of discretion. But like in California, the commission has really kind of set the pace of the market growth. They really spearheaded an incentive program that allowed, as part of the Million Rooftop initiative, Governor Schwarzenegger at the time was really pushing. And then lastly, local policy impacts the development of renewables. We have permitting standards, and there's an effort nationally to help streamline those to make it, lower those, what they call the soft cost. And then we see, like in Gainesville, some municipal utilities will offer a feed-in tariff. And without getting too much into the legal framework of that, you can't require a utility to purchase electricity above their avoided cost. So you have exceptions when cities could do this and get away with it. But if a state tried to pass a feed-in tariff that's in excess of avoided costs, it would be preempted by federal law. So, what is driving the bus around here? We, I think, covered most of this. We see, utility-sponsored procurement. Duke Energy puts out a lot of RFPs in North Carolina. The solar QF market in North Carolina is one of the biggest, which is my home state now. So it's good to see that. But on the customer side, North Carolina is really lagging behind, well behind Louisiana, actually. From the presentation yesterday, I think Andrew Owens said there's 17,000 rooftop solar systems in Louisiana, and that's a big number. So I'd like to see more detail on that. But and as I mentioned, customer-driven solar market, that's one that doesn't really necessarily have a boundary. State law might put a boundary, as in Louisiana, there's a 0.5% cap. So that means well, Jeff, I'm going to look at you when I say this. I'm not even going to get into how they are going to calculate this. But, let's just say it's 0.5% of the peak load of the utility. It's not a lot. And at that point, they can just stop allowing that metering. Other states don't have caps, or they have caps that are 5%. And when you look at a state like California, 5% of their peak demand is like several nuclear plants. It's a significant amount of capacity. And lastly, net metering is, I think, without question, the driving mechanism for the customer-driven market. I mean, most customers don't want to become wholesale generators. They don't put solar on the house just to sell it. They want to use it. It makes sense to me. So Here in Louisiana, though, no mandatory RPS. There was some discussion of that back when I was in law school here. Had the privilege of working with the Alliance for Affordable Energy on that issue. PURPA, of course, is everywhere. Net metering, yes, it's been successful in getting some adoption along with the state tax credit. But I think as Forrest Bradley Wright was, I think, a really great presentation on where the trouble is brewing, and I think this is going to be an active year in Louisiana for this at the Public Service Commission and in other bodies. So I think I could recap Andrew Owens from Entergy's PowerPoint here in this slide. What is the big deal to utilities? Well, for them, you're generating power and using it on site. You're no longer purchasing that from the utility. So even if we forget about what you're exporting to the grid, they're selling less kilowatt hours to you. But then when you add on the fact that you're exporting kilowatt hours and getting credit for it later, and utilities will argue, well, your bill is much lower than it used to be, and when we calculate bills for residential customers, we look at the average. What is the average customer, and what do we need to collect from customers to kind of cover our what we need, what revenue we need to stay in business? And as he described, a lot of the costs that they collect through what's called volumetric rates. So each unit of electricity purchase pays for some of the fixed costs of the grid. So the argument is, hey, you're not paying your fair share of the fixed costs, so therefore we're going to come up with a charge or something that's going to pull you out and treat you separately. So I think we're getting a lot of it's kind of a philosophical moment now where we've been encouraging self-generation as a national policy, and all of a sudden, some of those bedrock principles were don't discriminate against QFs in the rates you charge them. If they're electric customers that are receiving electricity, it should be a fair rate. So you don't really set them aside there. And many state laws actually prevent discrimination. They say you must treat net metering customers just as you would any other customer. As we've seen around the country in the last year or two, that's changing very quickly. Utilities are trying to get the law to allow them to single out net metering customers, to treat them differently than average residential. So one of the, with this lost revenue, utilities had, I don't know if it was the utilities so much as some of the observers and commenters coined this phrase, the utility death spiral, which is very dramatic. And, you picture flames and angry mobs. The idea being that as you purchase less, the utility's revenue requirement has to be made up. So in the next rate case, they go to the commission and say, hey, we need to make this up, and we're going to have to raise rates for everybody. And the higher rates go, the more people want to go solar and avoid those rates. And it just goes out of control and things blow up. Of course, and I'm borrowing Andrew Owens. I actually had planned on saying this anyway, but he beat me to it. The Mark Twain quote, rumors of this death are greatly exaggerated. Well, there was recently a study from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab that showed if you had 10% solar penetration, that's a tremendous amount. California is not even halfway there yet. That you would expect average rate impacts of, I think around 2.5%, so range 2.3 to 2.5. So you think about how much your rates have increased over the last few years, or last 10 years. That's kind of on average there. And at 2.5%, it was a blip on the screen. And this was, I think this study did not even consider some of the benefits that would be associated. So this was not a cost-benefit study. This was just what's the impact on rates. And it's not going to run utilities out of business, even if 10% of customers are using solar. So, and the Empire Strikes Back, I know that's not fair to the utilities. But I will say, I remember someone came and spoke at my energy regulation class, and it was a VP from Entergy, and he said, come join us on the dark side. I'm going to hold him to it on this. So what are they doing to solve this problem of too many customers kind of leaving the grid partially from their perspective? One would be to charge an upfront fee for just using the grid. Increase customer fixed charges. So the idea is that you're not going to be able to get a fixed charge for all residential customers to get $50. No consumer advocate in their right mind would stand by and let that happen. But if if you peel off solar customers as their own class, it's a lot easier. They don't have the clout. There are only several thousand of them versus hundreds of thousands. So, we've seen that happen. Salt River project in Arizona, I think their board approved a $50 a month charge. I'm not fully up to speed on that, and it just happened. So it's breaking news. Standby and demand charges. So this is, the utility says this is what we have to kind of keep on tap to serve your need if your system doesn't work. So if we expect that you're going to cut your demand down when the solar system is working, but sometimes it might not, and we have to stand by. So I'll move here. And so another thing utilities would really like to do is to own more solar and rate base it. That means when a facility is used and useful in providing public utility service, they're able to get a rate of return on it. And I think those in the solar industry would love to have that problem of a guaranteed rate of return. So that's why I said pour me another. Let's see. Touch down here at the last bullet. Another way of dealing with lost sales is to have a revenue mechanism that allows you to capture what some of that lost revenue is and spread it among all ratepayers, not just on solar. In Massachusetts, there's a law that allows that. Arizona allows that. And currently in South Carolina, there's a settlement agreement that allows net metering to go on for 10 years, but it allows the utility to get a pretty hefty cost recovery. So it's not a bad deal for them. And underneath, as a problem of regulatory lag, it's kind of what I was mentioning before. The utility doesn't get their full revenue requirement because people are starting to buy less. They have to come 3 or 4 years or how many years later. And for them, that's a real problem. So I'm just going to skip through this. And I touched on, utilities want to get a piece of the action in the DG game. They want to involve themselves in the competitive market and lease systems. We've seen this kind of pop up a handful of states, but they want to do it, I think, pretty much everywhere. I've heard that talk. One of the big risks there is you have a regulated monopoly utility that has all the benefits of rate of return on their equipment and everything else. They know their customers, they have your data, they know who would benefit the most. Is letting that entity come into the competitive market really a fair practice? And those are questions that are going to be litigated, I'm sure, in the next few years as these programs start rolling out. And segueing into what Professor Stein's going to cover, storage is this would be the trump card. If you want to charge me $50 to have solar, maybe it's worth it, $50 a month to rent or lease a storage system that's going to allow me to go off the grid. That's not what anybody really wants. I mean, I think the companies that offer storage, it's more valuable when it's operating with the grid. And I imagine Professor Stein's going to be able to expand a bit on that. And also, I'm just going to leave this alone because I know we're running out of time for me. So Professor Stein, I'm sure, will love to talk about the amazing things that are possible with automation and storage, smart grid. It's going to be amazing what happens in the next few years. A lot of it's already happening. I mean, the technology's there. It's just a matter of deploying the infrastructure that's needed. So we definitely look forward to questions later. So thanks.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's mediocre, but we'll get started anyway. My name is Simon Mangan. I'm a renewable energy manager for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. We're a nonprofit organization based throughout the South. We have offices in Atlanta, Asheville, North Carolina, and Knoxville, Tennessee. I am based out of my home office in Lafayette, Louisiana, about 2 hours west of here. But my region basically covers from Louisiana all the way on up to Virginia. And I work on wind power. I don't know if you know, but there's not a lot of wind farms in the South. And in fact, we only have one wind farm in the South, and it's located in Tennessee. It was built about a decade ago, and we haven't built any since. Meanwhile, wind farms have been popping up all over the country, basically everywhere else except for the South. So I'm here to talk about why the South is about to have more wind energy, not only from wind farms generated here in the region, but also from other parts of the country. By the end of this presentation, I hope you get 4 major themes out of my talk here. First off is that wind power is cost effective today. It is a low price energy resource today. Secondly, that wind power is actually reliable. A lot of folks are concerned about what happens when the wind stops blowing. I'll do my best to address that. Next, I'll talk about some of the economic benefits of wind power, and this I titled this Wind Works. It's a popular hashtag, so if you tweet, check it out. You got one Twitter follower. And then finally, driving wind demand. How do we do it? What are the policies necessary to make wind happen or not happen in some cases? So starting off, wind power is cost effective. This is a convoluted map, but basically what it's showing you is installed capacity of wind farms across the United States. So the darker the blue, the more wind farms are installed. And as you can see, this map is actually a little old, but Texas typically has the most wind farms installed in the country, which some people that shocks. You expect like California or some of those Western liberal states to have more wind farms. Actually, Texas has the most wind farms. And it's usually closely followed by, and like I said, this map is old, it's usually followed by Oregon and Iowa and California. So it's not only liberal states that are doing wind power, it's many conservative states. And the reason why is because conservative states, particularly through the heartland, have a very good, robust wind energy resource. And so they're very excited to tap it and to use it. So we have a lot of wind farms, particularly in Iowa, which I'll talk about here in a little bit more. This is another convoluted map, or chart, I should say, but what this chart, and this is much more up to date, is from a study by a set of folks from Lazard in 2014. And what this is this shows the cost of different generation technologies today. Some of these are estimates, so the cost for nuclear down here at the bottom, that's an estimate, and in part because we haven't built a lot of brand new nuclear reactors in this country for the past 20 or 30 years. Other things like integrated gasification, combined cycle coal plants, again, this is an estimate because we haven't really quite figured that out yet. Other things like energy efficiency, this is a known cost. We know how much energy efficiency costs for utilities and for customers, and it is the lowest cost resource that you can use. So it ranges anywhere from $0 on up to $50 per megawatt hour. If you break that down to a kilowatt hour, that's normally what you see on your utility bill. That's about 5 cents per kilowatt hour at most. Is that right? No. Yeah, that's right. So 5 cents per kilowatt hour at most for energy efficiency. A close second is wind power. So here's your range here from $37 to $81 per megawatt hour. This $162, this is also an estimate, but this is an estimate for offshore wind farms. We haven't built an offshore wind farm here in the United States just yet, but this is the estimate for how much it's going to cost. So as you can see, even compared to onshore wind turbines, which is these actual costs here, offshore wind turbines might be a little bit more expensive. But nevertheless, wind power is extremely cheap right now, today. And if you compare wind power to other things like coal, which is down here in the dredges of cost world, even with gas combined cycle, with today's natural gas prices, wind is already very price competitive. The final thing I'll mention here is this is the unsubsidized cost of renewable energy. That means this does not take into account production tax credits, investment tax credit, state incentives, utility rebates, anything of that sort. So this is as flat as of a playing field as you can possibly get to compare things against each other. Once you start adding in the incentives for renewable energy, it gets even cheaper. This chart goes to show that wind power has actually reduced in price over the past decade and is expected to continue to do so going on into the future. Wind turbines have become so much more efficient at what they do that costs have declined anywhere from 24 to 39% over the past decade, based on where the turbines are placed. And the way they figure this out is based on the wind speed. So here you have a 6 meter per second wind speed, 7 meter, or an 8 meter. An 8 meter per second wind speed is really good, and it's kind of the stuff that you would find out in Oklahoma, and Kansas, places where it's nice and flat. Whereas here in Louisiana and the rest of the South, we tend to have 6 meter per second, 7 meter per second wind speed. So it's a little bit slower. The slower the wind speed, there's less energy in the wind itself to capture. So that means that your cost of energy is going to be higher if you put a wind turbine here in Louisiana versus out in the panhandle of Oklahoma. That being said, turbines have become so much more energy efficient and so much more efficient at capturing that wind that prices are now extremely cost competitive, even here in Louisiana, throughout the South, against existing generation. Not just new build generation, but existing generation. So we're expecting to see this sort of decline continue to happen. And the reason why the cost is going down is because the turbines are getting taller, so they can reach a better wind speed, and the blades are getting longer, so they can capture more wind. So I like to think of blades. Does anybody boat, sail, kayak? Okay, all right. I like to think of the blades as a sail. The larger the sail, the more energy you're going to capture, the faster your boat's going to go. It's similar with a wind turbine. The bigger the blade, the more energy they're going to capture, so the more power they can generate over time. All right, enough about cost. Let's move on to reliability. The wind doesn't blow all the time. That means you can't ever use wind. That tends to be the false narrative that folks talk about whenever they talk about wind power. They say, well, it's not blowing today, so clearly we could never use wind energy. What this chart shows is the United States is broken up into different grid regions, for a lack of a better term. What this is showing is that wind farms in those different grid regions are reaching exponentially high penetration levels at certain times during the year. So if you look, Xcel is probably my favorite here out in Colorado. Xcel Energy is a utility out in Colorado. At a time in May, in 2013, they were getting 60% of their electricity from wind farms in Colorado. It's a similar story pretty much across the country. ERCOT, which is basically Texas down here, they've reached a 40% at a certain time. Bonneville Power Administration in the west, they've gotten nearly 40%. MISO, which is directly north of us and we are now connected to here in Louisiana, 25%. PJM is a bit lower, but they've also got fewer wind farms. SPP, a third of their power coming from wind farms. So wind is a reliable thing that these utilities and these grid systems can use so long as they can balance it properly. This is, again, on an instantaneous basis, so it's usually over the course of an hour. On an annual basis, though, states like Iowa and South and North Dakota and Minnesota get over 20%, up to 25% of their annual energy from wind farms. Texas just broke a record here recently, and they get 10% of their total energy from wind farms. So it's not that you can't use wind because the wind doesn't blow, it's that you use it when you have it. To continue my boat analogy, you go out on the lake, and it's a nice windy day, so you're using your sail, and then all of a sudden, the wind stops. Well, that's when you can pick up your oar and start paddling, which could be solar, or you can turn on your motor and start buzzing back to get into dock. So you can use different energy resources when you have them available to lower your overall prices. Now this one is fun. So this is a study from the National Renewable Energy Lab that they did just a couple of years ago. And they said, okay, if this country were to go 80% renewable by the year 2050, could we do it, and how would that look? So what they did was they looked at all these different renewable energy resources and some traditional energy resources, and they said, can the grid handle it? And come to find out, yes, it can. So they looked at a day in July. July and August tend to be really terrible days for utilities. They have the most amount of energy to generate during that time. So it's a worrisome time for utilities. They want to be able to make sure that your power doesn't go out in the hot summertime afternoons. So NREL looked at hot summertime afternoons, and they said, okay, let's look at these hour by hour, at even 15-minute increments. What would happen if you used 80% renewables, and how would you do it? So they looked at wind, which is this kind of, what is this, like a beigey color? It's black and blue to some, it's like white and blue. They also looked at PV photovoltaic, so as you can see, the sun comes up midday, it drops off during the night, obviously. They've got some gas combustion turbines here to kind of balance out some of that load. Combustion cycle turbines. Here's hydropower. that they've got running throughout the day. CSP, which is concentrated solar power. They've got biopower, so biofuels and bioenergy. And then they've got coal and geothermal and nuclear down here at the bottom. But they basically said, yes, you can get to renewable, or get to 80% renewables. And here's the fun part. This dotted line here, this is a shifted load based on electric vehicles charging. Okay? So you can actually use electric vehicles as some storage. But what this goes to show is that you really don't need just tons and tons of storage. You don't need a one-for-one match of battery storage for energy. You trade off what you have when you have it, and you use other things when you don't. All right, wind works. Now this is going to be difficult to see, but this is the figure I want you all to pay very close attention to. The National Renewable Energy Lab, they're a bunch of geeks, and I love them out there. They've developed this thing called the Jobs and Economic Development Index, the JEDI model. Right? I love these guys. Anyway, and gals. But basically what this is you say, okay, I want to build a 100 megawatt wind farm or 100 or a 1 megawatt solar farm. How many jobs would be created from that? What sort of economic benefit would those jobs have? Tax revenue, how much would it cost? This, that, and the other. And it spits out a number based off of empirical data. So they've gone out into the country and said, okay, well, this wind farm was built. This is the jobs that were created from it. And now let's put it into our model. So what I've done here is I've said, okay, let's build a 1,000 megawatt wind farm in Louisiana. It's pretty big. It's a gigawatt, but it's not a lot compared to how much energy Louisiana actually uses. If you were to build a 1,000 megawatt wind farm in Louisiana, you would create over 4,000 jobs. That's a substantial number whenever you're considering just the small amount of energy that Louisiana would still be getting from that wind farm. So you could build a lot more wind farms and still have a lot more jobs. That's just the construction period. And then there's the annual jobs. Wind farms tend to not, and solar farms tend to not need a lot of maintenance afterwards. They still need maintenance, but you don't have to have things like emissions controls. You don't have to worry about water pipe intakes. You don't have to be concerned about fuel purchases. The fuel is free, wind is free, sun is free. And so there are jobs that are associated with operating these facilities every year after they are constructed. Now, how big is the potential here with these newer turbines here in Louisiana and throughout the South? And as I said, our region that I kind of cover is basically from Virginia down here to Louisiana. New estimates based off of currently available wind turbines suggest that Louisiana could generate over 50 or install over 50,000 megawatts of wind farms in the state alone. To give you a little bit of perspective, that's more than all the power plants in all of Louisiana combined. Okay, so technology has achieved something that people even 5 years, even myself 5 years ago, didn't think that we could possibly do. But we have so much potential here that these new numbers represent a huge amount of potential jobs in the future. This is a nice little map that kind of indicates where these newer turbines could be economically viable. And as you can see, Louisiana's got an awful lot of green. Green is good in this map. And throughout the South, there's an awful lot of area that could be good for wind farming as well. The other piece of this puzzle, as I was mentioning, construction, building wind farms is a good economic opportunity. So you may recognize the coloration of the states based off of wind capacity that I showed a little bit earlier. Again, Texas is nice dark and blue. The little red dots indicate manufacturing facilities. So this is where the components of wind turbines are actually made. So about 70% of the components of a wind turbine here in the United States are made in America. So it is a domestic industry. It's not that we're buying all these wind turbines from Denmark and Germany and Japan and bringing them over here. We're building them here in the United States. And in fact, we have these manufacturing facilities throughout the South, even though we don't have wind farms just yet. Nevertheless, there are an awful lot of jobs associated with wind farming, even here in the South, even without the wind farms right now. Finally, how do you drive wind energy demand? Right now, it may surprise you, but many of the utilities in the South are already buying wind power. Over 2.8 gigawatts, and this is a new number as of 2 weeks ago, 2.8 gigawatts worth of 2,800 megawatts worth of wind power are being purchased from utilities here in the South. The utilities include utilities in Arkansas, Alabama Power, Georgia Power, Gulf Power, which is a brand new one down in Florida that announced that they're buying some wind power. I don't even have an arrow for them. I'm sorry. SWEPCO in northwestern Louisiana, and of course the Tennessee Valley Authority. So these utilities are already buying wind power, but they don't have to. In many of these cases, the utilities are not forced to do it. There's no renewable portfolio standard, there's no state mandate, there's no federal government staring down their backs and saying, you need to do this. They're doing it because they want to do it. And here's just some quotes from some of these utilities. From TVA, wind power is a clean and limitless source of energy that directly enhances TVA's mission of environmental stewardship. Well, that's nice. Georgia Power and Alabama Power are much better, because they say adding wind energy to our generation mix underscores our commitment to a diverse portfolio. That means a clean, safe, reliable, sustainable, and here's the kicker, a low-cost electricity for years to come. And Alabama Power, these agreements are good for our customers for one very basic reason, and that is they save our customers money. They are buying wind right now because it's saving them money. That's why they're doing it. One way to reduce the cost of wind energy is by using something called the production tax credit. It's a federal incentive that has an on-again, off-again relationship with Congress. It's typically renewed in a one-year increment and then sometimes forgotten about and then comes back a year later. And this chart indicates what happens to the amount of wind power installed in this country based off, what's the yellow card? 2 minutes, all right, thank you. Sorry. Based off of what happens when the production tax credit goes away. So when it goes away, there's a huge drop-off in wind farm development. But when you have stable years of policy, so all the way from 2005 to 2012, we had a roughly stable production tax credit policy. And that's where you saw just wind power just take off and go gangbusters. And of course, 2013, the production tax credit had a tenuous relationship, and there was a huge drop-off in wind power installation. So making sure that the production tax credit is a stable policy that even phase it out over 6 or 10 years or whatever. Just make the industry know that it exists and there's going to be a certain deadline. One other thing that's driving demand, and I changed the title on this so it makes it confusing. The Clean Power Plan, the Environmental Protection Agency's brand new carbon rule. Law students, for the love of God, learn that thing inside and out. It's going to be ruining your lives for the next 15 years. It's a great thing, but it's very convoluted and very difficult to understand. Within the rule itself, to reduce the amount of carbon emissions in the United States, the EPA says, well, you can make coal plants more efficient, you can do energy efficiency, you can do gas plants, or you can do renewables. They offer kind of a wide range of things that utilities can do, and they even provide a guesstimate of how much energy that renewables could contribute based on their proposed rule. And I'm not even going to get into alternate targets and all this other fun stuff. But basically what they said was, throughout the South, many of the states could fairly easily reach about 10% of their generation by renewable energy, and that would help go towards this carbon reduction rule, the Clean Power Plan. If you were to add all of this up, all these gigawatt hours up, it would mean roughly about 30 to 40 gigawatts worth of wind power. So it's pretty substantial in terms of potential market demand for the wind industry. So I hope by now I was able to answer any initial questions about wind power being costly or how reliable it is and some of the policy implications. But hopefully we'll be able to hear about what the future holds with storage and how renewables can more easily get implemented into the grid. Thank you.
been talking me up so much, now I'm feeling worried, you know, because you come at the end and everything has already sort of been said. But that is why I'm sort of anticipating that, have a very brief introduction, assuming that I'm trying not to bore you, that many of you will be familiar with some of the initial slides, and then really try to focus my substance on thinking about energy storage and what this means for us. So doing that, happily, my co-panelists have already talked about the drivers for renewable energy. So I will assume you have all seen this lovely map of RPS policies across our state. Thank you, Simon, for talking about the Clean Power Plan. Don't have to mention much there, other than this is a big game changer as well. It is really this fascinating experiment in federalism. It is one of the first times that the Environmental Protection Agency is injecting itself so thoroughly into the energy choices for states. It's causing a lot of consternation amongst everyone, every single environmental panel and energy panel at any conference today, including ours yesterday, right? Didn't we have a carbon panel yesterday, right? Maybe you all came and learned about it. But very big deal in terms of shifting our energy resources. It is still only in proposed form, and everything that I'm hearing is suggesting that the gazillion comments that EPA got on the proposed rule, we're going to see some big changes when the final rule comes out, probably this summer. But I think that the changes are not going to be to the extent that we are no longer making the suggestion that they're saying, let's move away from coal and let's do more renewables. Hey, let's think about natural gas and nuclear. Let's focus on increasing our efficiency. These are all really important mandates. And then the states will be free to use their flexibility to decide how they're going to achieve these carbon targets. So a big deal that's pushing renewables. This is a slide you have not seen yet, so I will add this though, but Thad did a nice setup for me in talking about utility procurements driving these things. This is, California is our first state in our entire country to mandate that the utilities procure a certain amount of energy storage, which is a similar idea to the renewable portfolio standards that we have taken up, you know, of course, 29 states plus DC have taken hold onto an RPS type of a scenario, and so California is often a leader, and it'll be very interesting to see if other states follow suit with this. It is a requirement imposed on their 3 big investor-owned utilities. That's what you're seeing here, the Southern California Edison, PG&E, and San Diego Gas and Electric. And they say, of course, as you see, a sliding scale sort of increasing with time. But also very interesting that it is so specific. California has given specific targets for both energy storage on the transmission part of the grid, energy storage on the distribution side of the grid, and energy storage on the customer side of the grid, which is fascinating to me. To see how specific they've gotten with this, the relative scales. There are a lot of comments proposed on this, of course, as well, and the utilities saying, well, we should be more flexible, we should be able to do this and that. But this is a big mandate and a big push. The energy storage developers have sort of flocked to California saying, woohoo, now we're in, right? We have a mandate, someone has to buy our stuff. And so it's really, I think, if I have my crystal ball, right, what has happened with solar PV 10 years ago, I think we could maybe see the same thing with energy storage, where it starts out with a little push from governmental mandates, and then prices will start to drop. And so it will be very interesting to sort of follow what's happening in California. And I'll talk more about that when I get to storage specifically. So I assume that Thad would have already talked about solar PV, so I just did very quickly. I was happy you didn't show this chart though, just as sort of a reminder that this is what has happened with solar PV. This installed prices have just dropped enormously. And so the whole cost inhibition argument of, well, we can't do solar because it's so expensive, we can't do wind because it's so expensive, that's all changing over time. And we're seeing the technologies improving to a degree where it was not cost effective for you to ever think of putting solar on your roof when it was $12 per watt, and now it's dropped to $4. And you know, these charts are for the different size units, but there's also different prices depending on the commercial installed versus residential installed. And you probably know more people today that have solar installed than you ever did before because it's becoming more affordable for more folks. There's also more creative financing opportunities to do it. Like Solar City has the big leasing model where you don't have to put your upfront money, where you are instead leasing your rooftop to them, and they will come and they will install the solar panels and they will handle the maintenance. And that's very attractive to some folks who want to invest in solar, but they don't have the upfront funds to do so. And I focused a lot of my research recently on distributed energy technologies, distributed energy resources. They're sometimes called DERs. But just to remember, it also ties in nicely with DABs that a lot of this is being customer driven, but not always on just the residential scale. That we have so many big corporate names that have decided to, for cost reasons, for visibility reasons, for PR reasons, you name it, that they are going forward and making a stand in a lot of these investments in cleaner energies. Solar meaning big business, right? Just all the stats, of course, important, right? That there's a whole lot of folks that are doing a whole lot. But the top 10 corporate solar users, Walmart, Kohl's, Costco, Apple, IKEA, Macy's. These are big names. And my little thing works. The most recent announcement, if you haven't seen, Apple has just invested $850 million in a solar plant, which is now pushing it to the #1 slot on that list. And so they've paired with Solar City. That is not going to be distributed on an Apple facility. They're going to have through a power purchase agreement that Solar City is going to be running a solar farm nearby, and Apple is procuring that energy. So this is also a big driver, right? They have a whole lot of money, and they can have a bigger impact on the market than just a bunch of individual customers can. I think the other place we're going to see a whole lot of demand that's driving this is through the data center entities, right? The Microsofts, the Facebooks, the Amazons of the world. Because I went to an electric power conference, and the keynote speaker was the director of energy strategies for Microsoft, and it was fascinating. He was throwing out these numbers about 1.8 zettabytes of data in data centers, and just how massive that our continuing cloud obsession that we want to put everything up there, and these are the most energy intensive, these data centers. And so he was saying his whole job is to try to reduce their bottom line and cut their costs for energy. And the way that they're looking to do that is through distributed generation, through looking at energy storage. Iowa was having a proceeding in front of the Public Utility Commission on distributed generation that Microsoft got involved, and they submitted comments. So when those kinds of players are getting involved and talking about this, that, to me, I think, probably strikes more fear in the utilities for the death spiral than all of the residential usage. That, could you imagine if Microsoft could pull a lot of its and self-supply a lot of its own generation? That would be fascinating. Okay, so another way, since part of the focus for today was in terms of the economics of all of these things, in case you hadn't heard of it, I just wanted to also let you know there's things going on out there like the value of solar. Thad had talked about the net metering, which is the one most of you are probably more familiar with. But there is a competing model to try to capture the true value of solar in these situations, and it's this value of solar tariff. And it gives solar customers a credit for your electricity you generate via solar. You're compensated, though, based on a broader assessment of benefits that's provided by the solar than what you get through net metering. Most of the net metering jurisdictions, you're paid the avoided cost. And the idea behind this, it is only used in Minnesota and Austin, Texas right now. Minnesota had this very big proceeding on the value of solar. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to go there and do a little research. And so it's yet to see sort of what are going to be the impacts, but it's the idea behind they're really trying to get these ledgers of, okay, folks are trying to say, well, solar, you're imposing a cost on others, right? But yes, but solar is also providing a benefit, and they're trying to actually put a price on things like, well, what reliability benefits are you providing to the grid, not just to yourself by self-generating, and trying to put all these things together so that we're not just isolating ourselves and siloing and looking at one aspect of these important pieces. But I mean, when I get to use my, 10 minutes left, is really on energy storage. So can energy storage be cost effective is how I framed it, and I guess I need to start with at least a definition of energy storage, because when you hear energy storage, you may be thinking like, oh, like putting oil or natural gas in a cavern, I'm taking energy and I'm storing it. but that's really not what energy storage is about. These are visuals of energy storage. If you have never thought about it before, the #1 form of energy storage in our country is pumped hydropower. So who would have thought that, right? You kind of read the papers and you're thinking batteries, that's where energy storage is. But that's not our historical form of energy storage. Well, how is pumped storage energy storage? Because it is a form of arbitrage. The idea was that when prices were low, we would pump the water uphill and put it behind the dam, and we would wait until prices were high, and then we would release it. And that is storage, because it's capturing previously generated electricity and in some sort of the actual potential kinetic chemical form, and then release it at a later time. Flywheels, that's what these things are. New York has invested heavily in flywheels and beacon power in New York. And so they're literally keeping the, very short time periods for how long you can sort of keep this electricity there and waiting. But sometimes that's all you need. Sometimes it's minutes that's the difference between an outage, and depending on what you're using that storage for. If you're trying to get at the intense demands of trying to instantaneously balance supply and demand on our grid at any one time. I always think of the war room, right? And sort of war games and the crazy screens, and our grid operators have a very difficult job to do. I mean, the fluctuations, it's actually as ridiculous as the Super Bowl. If some really great commercial or some play comes on, you can look, and there's this huge upswing in demand, and the utilities have to call on backups. And when Prince William had his baby, there's this crazy chart I've seen that shows how the energy demand went crazy because everyone turned on their television sets. So they're trying to both deal with predicted fluctuations. We know this plant is going to go offline to fix something, but also sometimes the unexpected fluctuations. And so this is why energy storage is often talked about as being the game changer. Because right now, everything has to be instantaneous, and we don't have a great way to capture all those. I love the charts that say, we have a gazillion megawatts of wind potential and a gazillion megawatts of solar, that we don't ever need any other resource. Well, but we don't have a way to capture the excess right now. What do people do with the excess, right? If you looked, I liked your chart that sort of showed the NREL with the fancy colors with the blue and the gold. Because I often look at the California Public Utility Commission chart, which they have done a study which also shows very interestingly that, solar sort of peaks during the day and then drops off at 6 o'clock, and wind is sort of fluctuating throughout the day, and their peak was at 6 o'clock. And it was right when all of the renewables sort of plummet, when they are hitting their biggest peak. And so they have these huge ramping problems. Where what am I going to do? Because now if I'm relying on renewables, I don't have my base load, which means the sort of traditional fossil fuel. It's steady, 24/7. You just throw in more coal or more natural gas if you need more. You can't do that with renewables. And so energy storage can help smooth those peaks. We won't have those crazy things. We would be able to capture all of that excess. Right now, we have situations where we actually have to curtail wind because we have so much wind, we can't get it all on the transmission lines. And so what a waste, right? If we had a way to harness that extra and save it for when the peaks come, that could be a really essential component of changing the way that we value all of these different energy sources. I think it would also really eradicate a lot of the arguments against renewables, because one of the biggest attacks on renewables is they're unreliable. That, well, they're intermittent, and so since you can't rely on them at all times, that's it. But as Simon said, well, why don't we go to them first, and then look to our more traditional sources as our backup? And so energy storage can help with that. Oops, see, look, I did have. What do I want to say on this one? Okay, so this was the chart I just described verbally, but it's a little fancier now. So the yellow is the solar, showing the high peak, and look how much solar you get at sort of noon, but then at 6 o'clock, shoo. Green is wind, so you see it's kind of all over there, and blue is California's peak for their load demand. So right there, right when our renewables are tapering off, they're hitting a really big peak, and this is causing them a lot of concern as well. But this also places an increased value on storage. I think that when we talk about is it cost effective, there is no one answer. You can look at all sorts of different data showing all sorts of different numbers. And I think that because there are so many moving parts in energy, that the value depends on where you are and in what specific moment in time. And I think that it's really hard for us to capture those sorts of instantaneous fluctuations. But I also think energy storage is really unique because we, in our energy grid, function in categories. We're like lawyers, we're risk averse. We love categories, right? Let's stick everything in a category. Okay, let's classify it, and then we know what to do with it. So in energy, we generally function in 3 categories. You're a generation, you're the transmission, or you're the distribution. And we have all sorts of fun divides across all of those things. We treat them differently for different purposes. Energy storage is really interesting because it crosses over all 3 of those categories. It is like the first resource, I think, that I can think of that can be considered generation. It's the red box down here that Sandia National Labs tried to sort of isolate out all these different functions that it can provide. It also can provide transmission and distribution, like, you know, the line and transformer deferrals. The ideas are that you maybe don't need as much generation. We maybe don't have to build that new storage plant if we can use the excess renewable capacity. But if we can also use it to help with stability and voltage frequency and those day-to-day things, well, then maybe that's a distribution function or a transmission function. End use is the other category, which is that customer piece that we looked at on the California energy storage mandate. People also might just want energy storage for their own personal backups. Right now, what do folks do in New Orleans? Hurricane prevention, you go out and get a generator, right? And so how fascinating if it could be instead you go out and buy an energy storage device. Is that the way of the future? Would that be enough to help you? Well, let's see if maybe I move. I think one of the problems of trying to do this is that there's jurisdictional limits on trying to capture the full value of energy storage at this moment. For instance, if you're a generator, you're generally competing in the wholesale markets. If you are transmission, you are FERC regulated. That means that FERC has done all sorts of things to try to all these FERC orders, like, oh, let's pay a premium for fast-acting, quick-responding, fast-ramping, and more accurate resources. And those are all keywords for energy storage. Because the idea is our traditional reliability resources were generation plants, peaker plants, and natural gas plants that we could call upon. Many of our peaker plants are developed for that purpose. We call them peaker because they're for that moment when the peaks go crazy. That means that we use them something like 400 hours of the entire year. So many look to those peakers and say, that's not a very efficient investment for us. We need them there because the utilities have a mandate to plan for peak loads. They have to deal with the highest, not the average. And so then if you look at distribution, jurisdictionally, you're now in state regulation because the Federal Power Act provides a division. And Congress, in all its wisdom, said, great, interstate wholesale sales of electricity fall to federal jurisdiction. A wholesale sale just means you're selling not to the end user. Imagine there's a middleman there who's usually the utility. So you're generating, you are then selling to the utility perhaps. They come into the market, utility gets your resources, and then the utility packages that wholesale power with their distribution fees, and then they sell it to you, and that's the retail side of an electricity sale. So you're getting the retail rates. That's governed by public utility commissions and public service commissions. That's why we have, like, all across our country, we have such diversity in the way that we approach these things, which Thad was alluding to, that you just see that how complicated this whole system is, because even if one jurisdiction has decided to do something, you have 49 others where you have to sort of see, well, would that work here? Right? The wonders of our federalist system is that we have these laboratories of experimentation, and boy, are we using them for energy. We are all over the place, with California being most progressive in trying so many things, sometimes failing, sometimes not, but all the other states looking to them, oh, they're the first mover. Let's, you know, there's always some kind of the waiters. Like, okay, we're going to see if it succeeds, and if so, we're going to adopt it, and if not, we're going to stay away and say, ha, we're glad that it wasn't us. But we're in that mode now where we're seeing so much experimentation. So this makes it difficult. Why? Because if energy storage is classified as all 3 of those things, our legal system does not like the idea of double counting. Just sort of as Pat alluded to, like the utility is regulated and then are you going to let them play in competitive markets? This is what you're hearing. The controversy is, well, how are you going to make sure that they're not bidding energy storage into the wholesale markets, but at the same time, they're somehow getting rate-based compensation and they're putting it in their rates for you all? Well, but if it's serving multiple functions, then is that really double counting? But how do you isolate out the functions? Because they're so intertwined. I think it's very difficult to say, oh, right now storage is functioning as a distribution resource, but oh, tomorrow it's functioning as a transmission resource. And you're doing all that within the constraints of our jurisdictional grid. I think the other big limit that's preventing it from capturing its full value are ownership limits. We, in the electricity industry, we restructure. That's some call it deregulation, but I like to use restructuring. Historically, utilities were vertically integrated, which means that they owned everything. The generation, the transmission, the distribution, that was it. And then we decided it was largely based on monopoly concerns, right? That there was a natural monopoly at issue here. It doesn't make sense for us to have 3 transmission lines running along the same highway when one would do just as well. It would be more efficient to have one. But if you only have one, then you're saying there's a monopoly. And that means that the utility can just price gouge all of us, or any generator who wants to get on the line. And so the largely driven by the economists started to push much more for challenging the idea that there's a natural monopoly across all 3 aspects of our industry. Saying, well, we still see natural monopoly characteristics with transmission, but not so much with generation. And so we had many years of federal initiatives to push our markets towards competition for generation. That we now have those wholesale markets I've told you about that are competitive. And that opened up the world. Thad mentioned PURPA, which was also part of this initiative to say, hey, let's have other people compete against the utilities. We have to make it so that they can compete against this incumbent who's been there for 100 years. So how are we going to do that? It included things like making sure we mandated access to the transmission lines. And as all of that happened, that meant that the utilities were transformed in ownership. There was a mandatory forced unbundling of assets in order that the utilities wouldn't be able to give preference to their own generation assets. And states with retail competition do not allow utilities to own generation assets. This means, for instance, if you're a distribution utility, like Texas, Oncor, I'll tell you about them in a minute, that want to use storage, you need special approval from the Public Utility Commission or the PSC. And you have to go through this whole rigmarole in order to even, because if you are then owning an asset, that could be classified as generation. And so really complicated pieces that can be standing in the way. And more so the complication is because you'd have to deal with this on 50 different levels. You can't really just have one big federal rule that accomplishes everything you want. So, storage, though, I believe can be cost effective. I think it's not there yet, but I will give you these fun little anecdotal pieces. No statistical significance in any of them. But just to see where we're going. In California, that procurement, the mandatory procurement I told you about, the utilities were supposed to get 50 megawatts, and Southern California Edison procured 5 times the amount of energy storage required by the mandate, which pretty much blew everybody away. So if it wasn't cost effective, why would you go so far above the mandate? Now, I've heard little inklings that there was some bizarre natural gas trade-off in the background, but I have no proof of that. So we'll have to keep an eye on, is there something there? The California mandate does have a cost effectiveness component to it. Because, of course, the utilities are trying to protect the ratepayers at the same time while they're trying to encourage innovation, which is a very difficult balance. Texas is the other big headline story for energy storage. Oncor is the distribution utility there, the wires in Texas. Texas is one of those competitive restructured jurisdictions. And they have just requested approval for a $5 billion investment in energy storage on the distribution grid, which just blows away California. So again, sort of like Simon said, Texas, you might be surprised they're winning on wind. Guess what? They could be winning in energy storage as well. Texas may become the most progressive on all of these fronts. They are really pushing the boundaries on these things. And it's fascinating because they're in exactly that situation where the utility traditionally is not allowed to own this storage. it is an asset that they are typically not allowed, and so they have to get the special approval. Now what's fascinating is they hire consultants. There's a Brattle report out, and the Brattle report found that they are actually going to save ratepayers. This is, now they're trying to get this $5 billion wrapped into their rates and spread out to ratepayers. How in the world are they going to save money by investing $5 billion? Well, because they counteracted it with all the transmission and distribution line deferrals that they do not have to upgrade now if they get this storage on the grid. So trying to really, that's going to help determine the value, right? That's what this report was trying to do, was capture the true value so they can make this determination. And that they need to make that to the Public Service Commission. They need to demonstrate that this is going to be cost effective or they're not going to get this approval. Texas has also done some other things in terms of, just these are other examples where they really made the determination that investing in storage was cheaper than their other alternatives that were needed in order to address fluctuations on the grid. Wisconsin also was able to get a big energy storage investment. And San Diego Gas and Electric, the most recent news was that they are bidding packaged electric vehicle and storage into the wholesale energy markets in California, which is really interesting because, again, remember that chart where I showed you generation, transmission, and distribution, and where are you playing? Are you playing in front of the PUC and you're trying to get rate approval, or are you playing in the wholesale markets? And here they are not only pairing electric vehicles, which is the other big place we're going to be seeing potential tremendous growth. More than 13,000 electric vehicles are in their service territory. But we're seeing innovations, creative ways to try to package these things such that you can justify the financial benefits. So I think I'm almost out of time, but I'll just show you again, like sort of customer-driven, distributed energy storage. The energy storage pictures are not as cool as renewable, because just look, this is storage. Guess what? This is the basement of Goldman Sachs. That they have invested in thermal storage, and that they're big ice tanks, and they pre-cool in order to save money, and then they use, so they're pre-cooling off-peak, and then they use it. This is my friend Bob. No, not really, but I pulled this off of a lovely article. You know what this fancy thing is? Anyone recognize that red symbol? Tesla. And if any of you are following the news there, in terms of is this coming? The Gigafactory, have you all heard about this? Yes, that they're building, like Tesla has plans to make a gazillion electric vehicle batteries with the intent to help drop the price, that they're going to become more prevalent. But the biggest news of last week, maybe 2 weeks now, is that they said, oh yeah, and at the Gigafactory, we're not just going to do electric vehicle batteries, we're going to do home batteries. Batteries for your home. So distributed energy storage is just, it's coming between electric vehicles and home batteries for your house. Now, why would you put that in? Well, one, if you have your own solar rooftop, how fabulous that you really might not need the utility for as much backup as you did before. But two, they also are trying to sell it, I think, as also a backup for you. Like if there's a power outage, maybe you can just become more self-reliant, right? Aren't you tired of being left in the dark for a week when your utility fails you? Now, you know, I think there's interesting pieces we need to think about in terms of the islanding capability. So I'm no engineer, but my sense is that the microgrids have the ability to island themselves. So if there's a blackout, for instance, Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, I guess we should call it, Princeton had a microgrid. And they were the ones who were able to island themselves, and they were providing all the energy for the rescue services in New York, and they were like this wonderful poster child for trying to become more self-resilient. But my sense is most individual homes, there's a problem. Mike, you could probably speak to this more, right? That they're worried that if there's an accidental discharge of the energy back into the grid, you can harm the workers who are trying to restore the lines.
Most of the equipment is approved for that isolation to power the home and allow the grid to be safely worked on.
Good. And is that an owner decision or the utility? In the event of an outage, they can still
demands the equipment meet a certain third-party standard for that type of automatic safety feature.
Perfect. All right. So see, so that's coming too. Solar City just announced that they're going to be doing not only those rooftop projects, but have energy storage as well. So last piece, just potential solutions. What do we do about all this? Well, maybe amending the market rules to allow for multiple value streams without double counting. This is what FERC has been trying to do But see for Order 745, which they tried to do this for demand response, which we haven't talked about at all, but is this idea of instead of always saying we have to build, build, build more to meet our increasing demand, why don't we cut back on what our demands? And so efficiency fits under demand response. Demand response in this sense is that the utility will call you in a peak event, and you have been on a list to voluntarily curtail your load and not use some things that are not essential during peak times. And there's been a big complication about how do we value and price demand response in the markets. And FERC put out an order trying to determine, here's the price we're going to put on this resource. And the DC Circuit has recently vacated the order, saying, sorry, not only is this outside your jurisdiction, because remember, FERC, you're only in charge of wholesale sales. And demand response isn't a sale at all. It's just a customer who's saying, I'm not going to use my power. And guess what? It's a customer action, and that fits into the residential retail side, which means it's under state jurisdiction. So it has caused this huge hubbubaloo, and FERC has recently petitioned for cert to the Supreme Court. So it'll be very interesting to see if that goes. Note, by the way, that the DC Circuit also said, and by the way, even if you had jurisdiction, the way that you valued this overcompensated for it. And so that exceeded your authority, and it was arbitrary and capricious as well. So that will be very interesting to follow. Well, maybe we could relax ownership requirements for multifunctioning resources. But then what are the broader implications on competition? The whole reason we did this divestment was to try to make sure that we were not going to be having sort of favoritism and the utility couldn't favor themselves and their own resources. And how do we know that if we now relax those and sort of come back to that situation, that we won't have similar problems? Well, maybe we could facilitate private and public use of distributed energy storage and energy resources. This is part of what I've been looking at because I think that it's a very different model where individuals are procuring these resources for their own private use. And that means that this may be part of why utilities, of course, they're mad because it cuts into their revenue. But what if there was something where the excess could be then opened up for public use? This is part of the idea behind electric vehicles. That many say, well, when they're all plugged into the grid, it can become a two-way storage for the grid. But this involves massive amounts of, just think of the contractual regimes that are going to develop here, because you're going to have to be thinking about, you know, the high transaction cost to do all this. You have to somehow individually negotiate with each person for demand response on a residential level. One of my colleagues, he's an engineer, and he's done all this work to show that in Florida, 1 million pool pumps is actually the demand response equivalent of storage. That is cheaper. If you could get all these people, if you have a pool pump, you actually run this crazy filtration thing for like 6 to 12 hours. You don't really care when it runs, so why in the world should that be running at peak? You should just be able to get all these people to sign off and say, I'm going to automate and I'll control your pool filter. So long as it's clean, you don't really care when. And so in terms of cost effectiveness, it's very interesting to figure out, instead of saying, hey, this one technology is cost effective, I would actually argue that we should try more to target the function that's needed and then see which technology is most cost effective to achieve that function, because it may be a combination of a lot of things. For instance, if we said we need a fast ramping, accurate load following device, great, energy storage might be the winner. But guess what? Demand response might be the winner. You may be able to do the pool pump thing for much cheaper. Combined heat and power. I have another engineering colleague who is hell-bent on combined heat and power. He says this is so much cheaper than all of these other things, but it's not cool and sexy, so it doesn't get any of the attention. Well, the value of all of these things is variable, and I think that, you know, National Renewable Energy Labs has tried to do a flexibility supply curve, because it seems more and more that that's really what energy storage is trying to provide. And they have said the lowest cost items are flexible demand and supply and reserve sharing. And then maybe flexible generation, new loads. Look what's here, the highest cost items. Electricity storage. And why? Because right now, $700 to $3,000 per kilowatt hour. That is very expensive. But look here, the Encore consultants, they figured by 2020, which is only in 5 years, that it could drop to by half, to $350. And Tesla, if they have their way, 110 kilowatt hours. Sorry, hours, yes. $110 per kilowatt hours for storage. So will we see that same precipitous price decline chart that I showed you for PV panels? Will we see the same thing for energy storage? and that its value can be changing over time. So that's all I have. So, questions for our illustrious panel. I don't think we have an actual moderator, so I'm happy to field questions for everybody. Well, we just blew your minds? Come on!
What do utility companies do with excess electricity now? Obviously they turn down the generation if demand suddenly, but there must be a lot of waste in the system.
Yeah, I mean,
it just gets dumped to ground somehow, or?
So, well, there's different capacity factors for all of our different sources of generation. So, meaning, you know, like, I guess maybe if we go back to the wind curtailment example, for instance, right? There is tremendous waste there. So we have that situation. I think that the planning element of utility, Thad, you may want to speak to the planning. Do you do more of that than I do? But the planning element, we have all these very complicated formulas for the utilities to try to figure out how much they need. We actually have 3 different energy markets. So one is for the electricity itself, one is a capacity market, and one is an ancillary services market. The capacity market is a 3-year ahead market. Then we have day ahead markets, then we have hour ahead markets. So they're constantly readjusting, sort of based on what's happening. But they start out with the ones, we think these are going to be necessary. We know at least in 3 years we're going to need these. And so I think one of their primary goals is trying to make sure there isn't a whole lot of waste. We have an auction system where these things bid in, least cost. All these entities bid in, generators will say, I could offer you 100 megawatts at this price, and I could offer you 50 megawatts at this price. And they all get stacked in a bidding order, and they take the least cost ones first. And wherever the last resource is that meets all the demand they needed, that's the clearing price, and then everybody gets paid that price. So there's this a way that on it, it's more dynamic than I think what your question suggests, but I don't feel like there's tremendous waste on a daily basis.
Well, physically, for wind turbines, what they do whenever there's curtailment, typically it's very pronounced in the Pacific Northwest, where they have an awful lot of hydro and wind farms. So during the wintertime and early springtime, when the snowpack starts to melt, they have just tons of water behind the dams that they have to get rid of.
And why? Because
the dams will blow up.
No, and also Endangered Species Act. It's one of those perfect fighting environmental, because the Endangered Species Act requires stream flows for the salmon there. So they have to let the water run first before they can take the wind.
And so whenever and particularly wintertime and springtime is just phenomenal for wind power. So you have tons of water, tons of wind. What do? The easiest thing is to turn off the wind turbines. And the way they do it, wind turbines, the blades themselves actually pivot, they pitch into the wind. And so if they go completely flat like this, they'll stop spinning. It really pisses the wind farm operators off because they're not making a buck. And there's some lawsuits over that right now.
Well, there was a big fight, at least at BPA, that's the one that I'm familiar with, because they only got the credits, the renewable energy credits, if they generated. And so they actually sued them for saying, all these other people, they were so happy for us to say, no worries, we'll satisfy all your obligations, because that saved them fuel costs. They didn't have to fuel their coal plant or fuel their natural gas plant. But the wind operator said, wait a second, we have no fuel costs. We were going to make our money through generating and getting these credits. So they ended up settling, and they had to pay them the credits. Yeah. Sure, in the back, and then yeah, no, you. Yeah.
I read that transmission lines lose 50% of the energy that's transmitted, electrical energy.
That seems
Is
high.
that
That's
true?
too high.
That's way high.
Is that too
But
high?
there-
What is
there must
the
be a lot
efficiency
in any-
along the transmission line?
It depends on the type of transmission. So the distribution lines, the ones that go into your home, are significantly less efficient than the actual transmission lines, which are very, very big.
Yeah.
So there's a proposed high voltage direct current transmission line that would connect about 4,000 megawatts of wind farms from Oklahoma directly into Memphis, into TVA territory. It's a 720-mile transmission line using direct current, not AC. They're estimating.
How efficient is the direct current?
They're estimating a loss of about 3%.
3?
Over 720 miles.
I would add, I mean, this is for distributed generation a big deal. It's something that, it's not really given its due credit in terms of avoiding line losses. So if you're generating on-site and if you have some excess, it's exported to your neighbor. Your neighbor's going to consume it before it gets much further. So, you know, in that sense, you might be avoiding line losses of 8 to 11 to 12%, and somewhere in that range. And you know, particularly like in hot days, transformers might not operate as well, as it increases the losses. So I think there's, you know, another element of, you know, DG serving on-site load is kind of taking some demand and some of the pressure off of upstream, you know, assets too. So I think it's an important issue is you know, the impact of distributed generation and kind of relieving the stress on the overall infrastructure.
Now there is a huge loss, an absolutely huge loss from fired power plants. So whenever you burn something to generate the electricity. So it takes, for a coal plant, for instance, it takes something like 10,000 to 11,000 BTUs to generate a kilowatt hour of electricity. That's a huge loss of energy in one form, heat, to transfer it into another form, into electric generation. And so maybe that's where you've heard the 50%.
And it reminds me of another interesting complication of all of this, which I've heard, which is the problem like that. Remember that California chart? So if you shut off, you need your baseload plants in the morning, and then if you shut them off to take all that renewables, you have to sometimes start your plant twice in one day, which is actually way more inefficient. And I've heard talks now about the Clean Power Plan, that they're looking for an exception. Are they going to be able to, you know, because right now they might violate their Clean Air Act emission limits because they have to restart twice in order to accommodate renewables, and then we're really blowing minds, right?
Well,
like,
and specifically to this issue, the reason why it's so terrible, baseload power plants, coal and nuclear in particular, the way they generate electricity is by boiling water, okay? If you think how long does it take for your tea kettle to start up, multiply that times 1 million or 1 billion. And that's how much water we're talking about on a daily basis for each one of these types of power plants. So it takes a really long time for them to build up the amount of heat to create the high enough temperature steam. And sometimes, so when hurricanes come through, particularly in the Northeast, if they're bad enough, they'll shut the nuclear plants down 3 days ahead of time because it takes that long for them to cool down. And then it takes them another 3 days to heat all the way back up to get back up to capacity. So that's why these baseload plants, particularly nuclear plants, hate renewables. They don't play well with renewables. Whereas gas plants, fuel cells, and storage, you could turn them on almost at a drop of a dime. 15 minutes, 1 minute time spans. They react very quickly. Nuclear plants and coal plants do not. And so if you turn them down, you turn down for what? Okay, all right.
So Mike, and then you in the back. Yeah.
So your comments stretched perfectly to match my question. I wanted to hear characterization all the way between distributed generation and central power plant to the fuel source. So thank you for that. So now I'm going to ask, what about emerging markets for renewable energy credits? Are the EPA rules going to, if they survive challenge, are they going to revive the marketplace?
I think that would be the easiest way to do it. The way the rule is right now, it's very difficult to understand how states get credit for renewables. So, as I said before, a lot of utilities in the South are buying wind from Oklahoma and from Kansas and Iowa. They're buying it from other states. With the EPA rule, the question is, okay, who gets that credit? Is it the state that generates the electricity, or is it the state that buys the electricity? You know, convoluting this all together is individual states have multiple utilities in them. And so how does a state get credit for a utility's purchase? So there's a lot of bubble room in there, I'll call it. I'll coin that term today. The best way to do it, though, in my opinion, and some of our comments to the EPA on this, was to develop some sort of way that if you buy the power, regardless of where it's generated, you should get the attributes of that power. So if you're buying wind from Oklahoma in Tennessee, Tennessee should get that credit. If you're buying coal from Missouri and you're shipping it to Arkansas, Arkansas should be punished for that.
I might just add that to the extent states that have rec markets and have kind of well-defined targets that you may have technology-specific values. So solar RECs will be way more valuable than wind RECs. And I don't know about with this plan, if it's just going to be technology agnostic, as long as you're getting pollution out of the air and you're not putting it out there, that it's fine, then that's going to mean that the REC price is going to be the wind. I mean, it's going to be the cheapest.
And I also think, you have leakage problems and all of these issues associated with the credits and the different markets. And so it's interesting because it's a federal standard, but we're letting the states do what they want. So I would think it would be, there's some encouragement for the states to work together. And so if you could get some sort of a regional agreement that would be a way, I can see that being a way to accommodate, like if you were buying from a neighbor. And, it may encourage a few more of these kind of Reggie-like situations for maybe even, there's a bit of question about, could you establish a trading program under the Clean Power Plan? Would that be compliant? And could you impose a carbon tax? And if the state wanted to do that, would that be a way to comply?
And how would that work if you had a national
right,
tax?
Without...
I mean, does that basically supplement what the 111D does?
No one knows how it's going to fit in.
The way, okay, you could put a carbon tax plus the EPA plan plus instigate, require an RPS. You can do all those things in theory. In political reality, it's going to be horse traded. So you're either going to get the hairy, messy EPA Clean Power Plan, or Congress would end up passing some sort of law, and then the president would have to sign it that says, okay, instead of that, we're going to institute a carbon tax. So you're not going to get both. Especially under the Congress that we currently have. I would be highly skeptical.
All right, last question. You've been
okay. The question I have is, there are, as you've pointed out, some always competing environmental interests in all of this. You talked about the hydroelectric and salmon and things. There are bird issues that we're dealing with too. We're dealing with flyways and the bird impacts. And how do you reconcile that? How do you reduce the negative impacts of wind turbines on migratory birds?
Absolutely. So this is a major concern for wind farm developers, to make sure that they aren't causing an excessive deleterious effect on the environment. Several studies have come out recently that said nationwide wind turbines, all of them together, cause about 350,000 bird deaths per year. Right. To put that in perspective, hunters kill 14 million ducks per year. Buildings kill 1 billion birds per year. Cats kill 3 billion birds per year, plus small mammals and insects and this, that, and the other. But if you compare it on an energy by energy basis, fossil fuel power plants are 34 times more deleterious to birds than wind farms. And it's because of habitat destruction due to mining, it's air pollution, it's water pollution, and it's even flying into the power stations themselves. There was a really big event in Canada here recently at a liquid natural gas facility. In one day, it killed 34,000 birds by accidentally scorching them to death.
Right.
I mean, that's 1% of all the wind farms in the United States.
Yes, and climate change.
Oh yeah, well,
oh yeah, don't forget about that.
We don't talk about climate change in the South.
I do.
It doesn't matter. So birds.
I'm from Chicago.
Okay, all right. So birds are a concern for wind farm developers. You can make better decisions on where to place the wind turbines, but compared to the status quo, which is way worse for birds and all of life, and then B, compare it to other huger, much more bad impacts to birds, wind farms are really not that big of a deal. And a lot of the times, you'll particularly hear it on Fox News, oh, wind turbines are killing all these birds, when in reality, there are people out there that want you to hate wind farms. And they are pushing this narrative that they are bad for the environment, which is not true. So.
If only we had a way to compare all the apples to apples and all of these choices, right? So just remember to never look in your one little silo, to try to really think about it in the big picture, and maybe we can come up with some fabulous solutions. So thanks for joining us, and go get some lunch.